with respect for our time, and as we all start to gather, let me just start us with a brief word of housekeeping and introduction. This will be the Saturday morning version, a little less formal, and as we just continue our conversation. So I wanted to begin just by saying welcome back, everyone, to the second part of our fall lectures in theology and ethics with the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones. We're really glad to rejoin for a little over an hour, about 70 minutes this morning for conversation and kind of thinking our way forward together. I did just want to add the brief note of thanks again to everybody who made this possible, people in Charleston on our staff, people at Union in New York who made this possible, and also to the Circular Church Endowment Board, because it's thanks to their generosity that we can bring the finest scholars in the country and just make them available and accessible to all for free. So that's really a wonderful thing to do with an endowment, is to provide good ideas to everybody and then allow those ideas to inform our practice and our living. Our format this morning will be similar to last evening's. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Jones in a moment, and she'll present to us, and then she and I will begin a conversation together, and then we'll invite all of you into that conversation. So at any time, please enter your question into the chat, and we'll do our best just to get through as many as we can, hopefully all of them, and would love for you to be a part of the dialogue, and that will shape our time together. I think most people know this, but it really needs to be said every time we gather, that at Circular Church, all are welcome. And the church at large, I think, doesn't always have a great track record with welcoming. So let me just be very plain. At Circular, we welcome people of every gender identity and expression, every sexual orientation, every race and ethnicity, every age and life experience, every faith and philosophy. Whoever you are, we're glad you're here and you're welcome to be a part of this conversation. It's better the more of us we have. So welcome. And with that, let me just introduce Dr. Jones. The Reverend Dr. Serene Jones is the president of the Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. She is the Johnston Family Professor of Religion and Democracy. And she is our teacher this morning and our friend in conversation. Dr. Jones, Serene, we're so glad to have you back with us, and welcome this Saturday morning virtually to Charleston.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, and it's good to see in the chat all the beautiful good mornings from across the country, and to be back with you. And as I was saying to Jeremy before we got started, there's something very special about Saturday mornings. They always feel so full of possibility and freshness. So I am glad to be with you here, full of possibility and freshness. So I wanted this morning to come back to the topic of trauma and grace, resiliency, hope, where we find it. Yesterday, we focused a lot in our conversation and in my reflections on huge and systemic and deep historical traumas, and what does it mean from the perspective of faith to engage those, and why it can seem so frightening, and how it's not nearly as frightening as it seems. But I realized that is a extremely important conversation for us to have and for us to keep on having, but that it's also the case that we're in the midst of a huge traumatic event right now, all of us together, and that is the pandemic that has been with us for now 19 months, still continuing. I spoke to a community in Oklahoma City on Thursday evening, where they had just surpassed 10,000 deaths. And for a state whose population doesn't even hit 4 million, it's statistically a level of trauma and death that is even greater than what I know many people think of as that startling moment at the beginning of the pandemic when it hit New York City so hard. Of course, when it hit New York City, there was so little we understood about what was happening. And we didn't yet have a sense of what ways forward might look like. But I remember well, especially the early days. And I am reminded myself that the trauma of living, much less the trauma of being close to people who didn't live and won't live through this pandemic, is still with us. One of the things about traumas is that the way our bodies and our minds work is that while we're in the midst of traumatic events, and in the clinical literature on trauma, there's millions of different ways of talking about what it means, and we use the term colloquially as well as clinically all the time. But the basic definition of a traumatic event is an event in which an individual or a collective of people, a community, feels themselves overwhelmed by an event that they experience as threatening to annihilate them, and against which they feel helpless. And post-traumatic stress disorder simply names the ways in which the effects of being caught in such a situation continues to linger in the body and the mind far past the time of the event itself. And the ways our bodies deal with being in the midst of a traumatic event, whether it's a momentary event or event that lasts 19, 20, 21, 22 months, is to, as much as possible, try to stick it in a corner of our brains and our hearts and our bodies so that we can keep our attention focused and our energy focused on dealing with what's pressing upon us in the moment. I mean, in that regard, we're just like animals who, when they're under attack, everything in their system shuts down except a part of their system that allows them to run, and to run as fast as they can to find a place of safety. We also know from the study of trauma and threat in animals that when they find that place of safety, if they find it, they usually collapse and fall into a deep sleep that may last a day or 3 days or a week. And it's hard to talk about the trauma of COVID because in so many ways, in very real ways, we're still so deeply in the midst of it and unable to process it because our bodies and minds are giving everything they have just to keep us alert and moving forward and trying to stay connected to one another as we move through this difficult time. But I just wanted to share with you one event that I myself have not begun to process completely, and I think it will take years to do so, and it will take a lot of work with the community. But when the pandemic first began to hit New York City, we saw glimmers of it in February, but didn't quite understand what was happening. Because Union is very close to Columbia University, which has one of the most advanced departments of epidemiology in the world, we knew that we were getting good information, but it was on a Sunday evening in March that I received a call from the head of health at Columbia saying, tomorrow we are going to be telling the university that on Wednesday we're going to be shutting down, that we're going to be starting our spring break early, and that when we return from spring break that we will be going remote. And then he proceeded to talk to me about the dangers of congregate living. And what does it mean to have a pandemic descending upon us more rapidly than anyone could have imagined, and to have large numbers of students, in the case of Union, living in very tight quarters where all of the cooking space and all of the bathroom space and all of the living space outside of your own small room is a shared space. And so in addition to flipping Union overnight into remote mode, to have emergency meeting of the faculty, to tell them, much to their shock, that that starting 2 days later, they would be teaching on Zoom. I had to try to convince the students that it was in their best interest for us to get the density levels in our dormitories as low as we possibly could, which meant their leaving campus, if they had another place to go, as quickly as they could. And so many Union students complied with this that within a period of several weeks, we were able to get the density down and never in those initial weeks had an outbreak or suffered the loss of life. As it was happening all around us, however, it was a trauma unlike anything I had experienced before, which was just the constant sound of ambulance sirens. And I don't mean like once every 10 minutes. I mean the constant sound of sirens. And the pictures in the newspaper of the refrigerator trucks holding the bodies. My daughter's partner is in the National Guard, and he was deployed immediately in New York City to help with the lines at the hospitals and with food distribution to families and people within hospitals. But I also remember most profoundly that week in which I was first trying to get the students out of the dorms and realizing that if they didn't leave and they needed to leave on their own accord, I wasn't going to force them to leave, but that we could have a very serious outbreak. I live in the same building with the students. It wasn't so much my own life I feared for, but I remember waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, just completely consumed with fear that in the very place where I was supposed to be a leader, we could potentially have mass casualties, because that was what was happening all around us. And that was something that had never in my life awakened me at 3 o'clock in the morning in something verging on a panic attack, that this was a real possibility. And it was that sense of being threatened by an overwhelming force that threatened to annihilate, that was in the process of annihilation, annihilating so many, And that at the one hand, you had some sense of agency. I could write the notes to the students that said, this is why you need to leave. I could have our blessed frontline caregivers cleaning the bathrooms and the kitchens constantly. But at another level, I was helpless. I didn't know what the future held, and I didn't know how the virus would play itself out in our dormitories. In the school just across the street from us, a number of students died. Not union students, but a number of students died. And as reports of those deaths began to come in, I think the shock of it hit the whole community. Last 2 Fridays ago, on 9/11, New York City commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And it was actually on the day of our opening chapel. And so those of us who remember 9/11, it was interesting to be in a room full of young people who were mostly under the age of 5 when 9/11 happened. So they only have the stories that they've been told to remember it by. But we talked about what it was like in those days of 9/11 to have to deal with mass death, with an event of overwhelming violence against which those caught in it were completely helpless to respond or to defend themselves. And then, as we all know, in terms of frontline caregivers, first responders, and families, the work of recovering from 9/11 continues. And on that 20th anniversary, we asked the question, what does it mean 20 years later to tell the story of that event? And how do we tell that story? What do we remember, and how do we frame the story in a larger story about our human condition and who we are and how we move forward? And in so many ways, New York has been a remarkably resilient city. But the question that was raised, and I think it's a very important one, is 20 years from now, how will we tell the story of this period to those who were young, who have no memory of it, and who will only remember it insofar as it lives in the tales we tell? How will we tell the stories of the absolute horror, sense of powerlessness, the sense of conflict, the reality of conflict, and the reality of serious illness and mass death? And how do we tell it truthfully? How do we talk about the difference between living, in my case, in a student dormitory building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan and living in Queens, New York, in public housing, where the rate of death was almost 30 times what it was in my immediate community? And if you were Black or brown in New York City, the chances of you getting seriously ill and dying were so much higher and continue to be that way. How do we tell the story of the bravery of the people who just came to work to take care of people who were dying? And how do we tell those very hard stories of people who died alone or died only with their wonderful essential caregiver, but not with their family nearby? How do we tell the stories of the conflicts, the international conflicts and the domestic conflicts that grew out of this? And most importantly, I think, how do we come to grips within our own lives with the impact of this event upon us, because nobody remains untouched by it. Nobody. There is not anyone on this Zoom today, but there is no one in our nation who's not been touched by this. And how does that trauma manifest itself? Well, right now, I don't think we fully know, because we're still in it, and our bodies are doing that animal thing of putting so much energy into making sure that we are safe and those we love are safe as best we can. But as it begins, as we pray, it begins to recede. The trauma of what we've experienced will come forth in bigger and bigger waves as our bodies and our minds allow us to take in the magnitude of what we are going through and have been through. And it's that at so many levels traumatic. We are deeply social beings. And I don't say that like an anthropologist or a sociologist or even a biologist. I say that as a theologian who recognizes that we are, insofar as we are the people around us and the world around us, the nature around us. We are insofar as we share the air that we breathe, the bodies that we touch, the places that we go, and those spaces that we share with other bodies. And what does it do to the human psyche to know that we are creatures that need that connection? Not only because at a psychological level we need it, which is a huge thing, but because literally to stay alive, we need to be touched and to touch others and to be profoundly connected. And yet we find ourselves in a time when the very thing that could give us the strength to survive is the same thing that is the biggest threat to us: other bodies, the breath of other people. Just pause and take in, what does it mean as a human being to reckon with the reality of the thing that you desire and crave with the best of your being is simultaneously the thing that is the largest threat to you? How do we live with that? How do we live with the isolation, the sense of being cut off, and the crazy way in which literally your body and your neurons start misfiring if you're not in a context in which you're getting the very things that you need to stay alive and to thrive and to be able to laugh and dance and feel safe? I think right now, all of us are, if I can use this language very gently and colloquially, we are not in our right minds and we are not in our right bodies because we are unable to be in right relation. And it's absolutely essential that as communities of faith, we're open about this. And being open about it may mean just being willing to be on a Zoom call where we honestly reflect together about the brokenness of this moment and what we're suffering. And I can promise you that in the weeks and months ahead, the outpouring of anguish that will come from us collectively is only going to increase. As the pressure lessens, the anguish, the wailing, and the sense of not being right finally has the chance to come out of us and see the light of day. But it is not, brothers and sisters, it is not a pretty thing to watch. It's very difficult. to watch it in your own self as that pain comes out, that isolation, that deep wail, that cry that is heard in Zion, the sound of Rachel weeping for her children. But that needs to be the space that we courageously step into, knowing that if that wail does not come out of Rachel or her children, the future that Rachel so profoundly desires to imagine will not be filled with the laughter that she seeks. And for me, the strength to let that wail come out of my own body, to hear that from others, is made possible by my knowledge, my deep embodied knowledge of the power of the grace of God. That even when I am not held by others, I am held in the arms of the transcendent God who loves me and loves this world and holds us gently and profoundly, regardless of what assails us. And I'll end by just saying two more things. One is, I find the Psalms enormously comforting. And I remember when I was first doing work on trauma, in my Bible classes in seminary, we were always told that the Psalms could be divided into three types, and they proceed chronologically. First, there are the Psalms of Thanksgiving. Then there comes the Psalms of Lamentation. And then there comes the Psalms of everyday life. And as I was studying the trauma literature, it became clearer and clearer as we were advancing. And this was back in the 80s and 90s, and weren't talking about trauma every day, but that the process of healings from trauma has to begin by first the person or the community who has experienced trauma knowing that there is a safe space in which Rachel's wailing can be heard. In the Psalms, that safe space is the love of God. Those are the Psalms of Thanksgiving, that even the wails we don't even know we have inside of us, God knows. God feels and God holds. And then there's those really awful Psalms of Lamentation. We often want to jump over those, but those are those Psalms in which the psalmist talks about, taking the children of our enemies and smashing their heads against the rocks and killing them. I mean, these are violent, awful, at times excruciatingly gross psalms. But what those psalms do, as communities across time have repeated them and spoken them, is they are that wail. And that wail has to come out in a way that's not constrained or appropriated or held in because of notions of propriety, but just spews out of us. So those feelings and experiences that have been there can find space and see the light of day, as I said. And then we also know from the trauma literature that the way forward, after there's been a space of trust in which the wailing can happen, the way forward is not a sudden leap into joy, but it's a slow path forward in which we find ourselves able to incorporate that reality of the trauma that's besieged us into a story about everyday life, in which we haven't jumped over it, repressed it, forgotten it, rejected it, but we've moved through it and we've brought it forward with us in a form that still allows us, as the psalmist says, to bake bread, to hold hands, to be together, to pray, to dance, to sing, and most importantly, to rest. So last thing I'll say is, I said at the beginning, there's so many theories out there, so much information about what it takes to recover from trauma, the different ways in which people and communities have found paths forward. But at the center of all of them is the recommendation that you simply cannot deal with the pain. You cannot deal with the psychological impact if you do not rest. If you do not find a place in which your body and your mind can simply find the space to slow down and let go in silence and deeply lay down your labors, so that when you awaken, you return refreshed with the energy that it takes to receive Rachel, the Rachel inside of you, and that wailing. So I know there's so much to talk about, but I wanted just to this morning dive deep into a space that we all share, not pretend like trauma is something far away somewhere else, but it's alive in us right now. And the challenge is for us to find ways collectively to move forward. So thank you. And let's have a conversation. Let's hear your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Serene. I think I have so many thoughts and questions, and I know others do too. The first of them, really, this sort of arrives in story form. But when I think about the church itself as a community, and what it might do for the larger community, or how it might function for us during these times. One thing I wanted to share with the group and with you, and we can send this out. Our dear friend Marjorie Wentworth, who's the former poet laureate of South Carolina, we commissioned her last year to write a poem about loss, a public lament that we would then post on the church gates, on the fence. And she wrote a poem. We were coming up on 100,000 deaths, which none of us could really understand at the time or imagine could be true. And she wrote a poem entitled 100,000 Names. And that was, it's traumatic now to even remember that it was only, if you can say such a thing, it was only 100,000 at the time. And it's so many more now. But that we posted that poem on the wrought iron fence as a way of publicly lamenting and trying to call the community to stop for a moment and be invited to grieve, because we felt like that was a part of being human, that we weren't doing very well as a culture. And we can either drop that link into the chat, or we can send that poem out if you're on this list and you don't mind. It's a beautiful reflection on the names we carry with us, the stories that are with us, the people who we don't want to forget. The other story that I think of when I think of the church is our congregation at Christmas time, at the winter solstice. We have a longest night service. We call it Blue Christmas. And other congregations have this too. It's for everyone who's grieving and feels it, especially during the holidays, and isn't resonating with the joy and the good cheer, and they're just blue, and they would like a place to be that. And so it's in a minor key, and we articulate it's for everyone who feels sad. If you feel sad, here's a place you could belong and be yourself, and you don't have to be anything else. And people come, Serene, they come to that service and they cry the whole time. And they cry with others. And just as you spoke, I was thinking, oh, every Sunday is Blue Christmas right now. Every Sunday is, and whether we acknowledge it or not, how do we make that space just for each other? And that those images came to mind. And I do have a question that I just sort of offer those images as we all think together about what might be helpful to each other. My question, you're so good in Call It Grace at articulating the God many of us don't mean by way, not the God who could have intervened in this situation, but didn't. The sort of cruel images of an anthropomorphic God sort of moving the chess pieces around. And so this person lives in the hospital and this person doesn't, those terrible and cruel images. But I'd love it when you say, when you talk about being held by God, could you say a little more about your understanding of what that means? Because I think I'll just add, here in the South, I think a lot of people are still envisioning that old anthropomorphic, some cruel idea. And I wonder if you could share what you're picturing when you say that, or how you experience it.
Um, my whole life has just been one long process of taking the God of my Sunday school when I was a child, and chipping away at that God, and emerging in the places that have been chipped away, new and more, I think, wiser glimpses of that mystery. The image of being held by God, I have noticed, and I always notice as an afterthought, not as it's happening. I think so much of our theology happens at an unconscious level first, and then it begins to find language. But in Call It Grace, I tell the story of my daughter having a reaction to peanut butter and going into anaphylactic shock when she was just months old, and my rushing to get her to the hospital, and her losing consciousness and breath on the way to the hospital, and then the emergency care people being at the edge of the parking lot to revive her. And she came back to me. And this was also the beginning of my very serious work on trauma. But even in her little baby body, she wasn't old enough to know what had happened to her. But you could tell even, when she was over her anaphylactic shock, and it's easy to get over anaphylactic shock if you can get an EpiPen, if you can get epinephrine in your body, she would just shake. She would just shake. She had so much trauma in her. And for probably 3 months at night, I would just sleep on the couch with her on my belly and my arms wrapped around her, because I realized that I couldn't somehow magically just remove this from her. I couldn't make this not something that had happened in her life. I couldn't also help but think constantly about all the children whose mothers didn't have cars to drive them to the hospital, or didn't live within 2 miles of a major medical center, and all those children who died from the same thing that she faced, and whose mothers were still weeping. But this just sense of of holding her as the only thing that I could do to calm her. And her shaking did begin to subside. And that's when I began to imagine in my own prayer life and my own meditation practice that the grace and the love of God is not like a doctrine or a statement or a emotional state, but it's literally, when I think of holding, I think of the grace of God as the reality of love that literally, without anthropomorphizing it, has its arms wrapped around the entire world and just holds the world like you would hold a child who's suffering. And you can't just make that suffering stop, but you can hold them. You can hold them as they cry and as they shake. And I imagine God in that holding, the holding mode with us in the present moment, not waiting some magic wand to make this go away, but giving us the strength of that awakening to the heartbeat of life that when you connect to it has the capacity to calm you.
Thank you. And that's so much closer than that aloof image. We're trying to move past. Although that aloof image was ingrained on so many in Sunday school or from the culture. So thanks. I think that's really helpful. I hope it's really helpful to others as well. It also just reminds me, Serene, that you mentioned in the book that so many of this is a paraphrase, so forgive me, but so many of your more profound shifts in your thinking or in your life, let's say, didn't actually come from your thinking, but they came more through embodied lived experience. And I thought that was so powerful. And it just made me want to affirm to everyone on this call that our experiences, again, are the source material for our theology. We don't have to have MDivs or PhDs, or we're human, and that's what we're working with. And so
that is a lot of material.
it's a lot. It really is. Everybody has a spiritual autobiography. Everybody may not have or need a dissertation. Those are different. And I honor those. So I grew up to sort of revere academia, and I still do, but not quite as much as lived experience, So, and as we are talking, I'd invite the group who has a great deal of wisdom from your own lived experience to go ahead and enter your questions into the chat, and we'll go right to them. Let's see, and I'm looking at Fu's comment, and some of these are addressed publicly and some are not, so I want to be mindful. And Fu does ask, first, Serene, thanking you for sharing what happened at Union and what it was like when it was first beginning, and the memory of that, and asks, how do we deal with the difference between those who receive trauma and those who are causing the trauma and also continuing to perpetrate the trauma? And Fu has written some about this as well, but what do we do with those differences between, I think, in some of Fu's language, those who are harmed and those who are causing harm?
It's as last night, it's an amazing question, and it's one that anyone who thinks about this can't help but think about. In the material on trauma, one of the things that is often mentioned is that one of the most difficult things about traumatic experiences that you can't attribute to a single perpetrator or perpetrators are much more difficult to process because there's nobody to blame. And the tendency, and most of this material has to do with floods and fires and tornadoes. There's a lot of material on traumas of tornadoes in Oklahoma. And I think that that's one of the difficult things about the pandemic is that while we can talk a lot about the long historic injustices that have led to health disparities that you can find perpetrators of, and we we do know that story, and we talked last night about what it means to tell that story and to tell it honestly so we can change those systems. When you're talking about a virus, it's also, though, very difficult to talk about the trauma in a way that you I think a lot of what's happening in our country right now. And I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm going to come back to it when it is people. But I think a lot of what's happening in our country right now is, in the absence of a specific perpetrator, what the human community tends to do is to find one and to make up one. And it's much easier for Democrats to blame the Republicans, Republicans to blame the Democrats, than it is to deal with a quote perpetrator that you can't, identify in a simplistic anthropomorphic way. Yes, when it comes to the kinds of harms that human beings inflict upon each other, it's absolutely essential that that we distinguish between those who experience the events of overwhelming violence and those who perpetrate them. And that is called history. And that's why it's important to tell the story of history true. That said, I think as one begins to unravel the histories of violence, you begin to find how often perpetrators are themselves survivors of traumatic histories and traumatic events. One of the ways in which trauma works in our brains is, I use this image of when this overwhelming lifetime of events happens to us, and we don't cognitively have a place to put it because it exceeds our capacity to know it. It's very hard for us to contemplate our own dying. If you imagine our brains as a kind of circulation desk, these events, they jump over the circulation desk and go right into the stacks, but they don't have a number on them, and they never make it to a particular place. They roam the stacks of our brains, and until we're able to name them and put them in a place where we can begin to understand them, we become destined to repeat them. And we often repeat them at unconscious levels. We repeat them without admitting to ourselves that we're repeating them. But for traumatized people, the most natural feeling in the world is to be traumatized and to continue to live in the loop of trauma. So I think that's one of the very difficult things about trauma, is that it perpetuates itself by reproducing itself if it's not pulled out and looked at. Now, that's not to say that you can reduce a discussion of oppression and systemic injustice to a discussion of the reproduction of trauma in our collective psyches. But I do think that, I was just thinking about this morning, it's like, when are we as a nation going to come to grips with the fact that, given the traumatic character of our origins, how we came to be, that we are all caught in this traumatic story in which there's Native American genocide, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, as I said last time. I mean, the list goes on and on. We can all add so much to it. And caught in that cycle, we have become, in the repetition of that cycle, cruel people. And we've naturalized our cruelty. We are a cruel nation. We don't like to think of ourselves that way. But and when I say we, that we is I think, amorphous we that we need to be talking about, who the we is. But we perpetuated and continue to perpetuate perhaps the cruelest system of human exploitation ever enacted in human history. And yet we've never had a public conversation about it. Anyway, so I'm connecting COVID to trauma, to oppression, to US history, to what does it mean to come to grips with your own cruelty caught in that traumatic loop?
And they are all, it's, you can see them all entangled, all together.
They are.
And think,
Well, yeah.
how many in the progressive church, how many of our members have been traumatized by their own religious upbringing?
Yeah.
Or, how many women said, I would like to be ordained and were denied, or gay friends said, I would like to be married and were denied, or, there's a long, or people who just grew up with an idea of an angry, abusive God who was going to punish them. These cruel and violent ideas and alienating ideas. And I think so often what we're doing in the progressive church is just trying to redeem some of this, for lack of a better term, trying to refashion it and say, no, actually the communion table that was used to exclude you, we would like to use it as a place where everyone can belong. And these sort of, which seems very simple, but I think can be transformative for people. I'll always be surprised, Serene, as long as I live, how transformative it is when I say that everybody's welcome and I spell out who I mean, and people come in tears to the table and say, I was sure you didn't mean me, because I've always been told everyone's welcome, but not you. And the ways those messages have been internalized. So I want to put the church on the hook here, that it has much, the institutional church and expressions of American Christianity in particular, that still have a lot to answer for. And sorry, friends, that was a little preachy, but I'm not that sorry. I want the church to own its part of this. Maggie Griffin, excuse me, Maggie does have a question. And talks about the reality of abandonment and rejection resulting from this pandemic. And she asks about our wailing and how it might be infused with grief. Learn to grieve in a way. And let's see. Yeah, I think she's asking about the role of grace also in our ability to grieve, or in our learning how to grieve during this time.
That's a very beautiful question. And that wailing that Rachel is doing for her children who are no more is grief. One way I've often framed it is as the task of moving forward in trauma is trying to find the ways in which we move from that raw grief to mourning, where the grief becomes, again, something that we know will not destroy us, but that we can bear and that we can move forward holding. And that comes right back to the notion of grace as that reality in which we are held. That's absolutely why in our churches and our communities, as these waves of grief and pain come forth, and we seek to move them from that rawness of grief to states of mourning, we're creating, as the first step, safe spaces to grieve. And I think that one of the things that's hard about grief is that we're fine with grief as long as it's containable. we want it to be crying and maybe a little bit of wailing, but oftentimes deep inside of grief is enormous rage. And we don't want that. We don't want to see that in other people. We want them to behave nicely. And that's why creating safe spaces where rage can be spoken and expressed and unleashed without harming others, but where we're willing to receive it, is absolutely important. And it's a repression of that rage that keeps, I think, grief oftentimes from moving from grief to mourning, because the animal part of ourselves that just wants to, claw out the eyes of some person or thing we imagine is responsible for this damage and this harm is so visceral and so profound. And there needs to be a place for that to be held.
Indeed. And as we go to our next question, I just want to share that during the deepest grief of my life, when I was already a senior pastor, I received, a million well-meaning, very polite and contained cards, and they were all lovely and heartfelt. And then I received one letter that looked like it was written by a wild animal. It was a couple of pages. It was wrinkled up. The writing was scratchy, and it was a letter of rage at what had happened on my behalf, like in solidarity with me. This man loved our family, and it was a crazy letter. And I opened it, and I still have it.
Yeah.
And I remember he's the sweetest, kindest man, gentle. And he said, was that too much? And I said, no, it was just right, because it was an honest expression of just being completely undone. Mm-hmm. And it was true. I didn't need every letter to be that. And I needed those containable ones, I think, probably as well. But he took a risk of being just wildly honest. And at least in that moment, it was just what I needed to feel seen, heard, held in a way. And Andrea just mentions also the trauma of everyday life of people of color in the US, which is ingrained for centuries and continues every day, all day. But also the trauma of those all over the world and the stories we see. And she mentions those in foreign lands. And I don't want to presume I know which one. I think there are so many images we each carry with us. Excuse me. So I'm also thankful, Andrea, that you mention that you bring the rest of the world into it, because so often we focus on just the US in our news and in our reading and in our attention. And that's a very small piece of the picture. And Serene, I don't know if you have thoughts. I'm going to scan through some questions to make sure we're getting them all as well. So.
I'm just on the one about the world. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that, national boundaries, we can imagine that they're there, but they're not like the big walls that Donald Trump wanted to imagine them being, that can keep out pandemics, but that we are so profoundly interconnected. And it's another way in which the suffering of this time is profound, because we can't connect physically with other people around the world. We've been cut off. I don't think we have yet as we grieve what's happened in the United States, we don't have any sense of the magnitude of what has happened outside of the United States. And it's devastating. And yes, I want to acknowledge the trauma of everyday life of people of color in this country, and of our trans brothers and sisters, and LGBTQ people, and of the elderly and the mentally ill, of the incarcerated, of those who live in poverty. I mean, the people whose life reality is traumatic are legion in terms of their number. It's not just a little slice of life.
And it does seem, for those of us within the Christian tradition, but all faiths and philosophies, I think will have a version of this. That's right at the core. The least and the lowest, the bruised and the brokenhearted, those who've been made to feel left out or who have been left out. That seems at the very core of our sacred stories about who we might take ourselves to be and how we understand our family. So again, I'm getting preachy. I guess it's getting close to Sunday.
But I think it's also why, and I'll say this about myself, speaking from my, the privilege of being a white woman, living in Manhattan, like one of the richest places in the United States, if not the world, in a, very elite seminary environment, that I think it's true that for all of us, I'm saying this about myself, that if we cannot process and work through and really be awakened to the impact of COVID on our own lives, we are not going to be able to be in solidarity with and work side by side with those whose traumas fail them every day. So I think that, oftentimes liberal privileged people tend to think my trauma is nothing compared to that other trauma. But the truth of the matter is that if you use that as an excuse to not be present to the trauma that thwarts your flourishing, you are not going to be the person who is capable of understanding and being in relationship to and working side by side with those who do experience tremendous suffering, because you've closed off your own suffering.
Right. And it's non-competitive. I think we can, everyone has their own experience, and we can, some of our suffering doesn't stack up to the much more intense and real suffering of others, but it doesn't also invalidate that. Perhaps we can use whatever suffering or understand whatever suffering we've experienced as a way of sort of breaking open a little more to the experience of others and being a little more present, better listeners with our heart, kind of as we mentioned last night. But rather than getting stuck in our heads, I'm interpreting my own suffering. Yeah. And since I'm this class and race, and it doesn't matter, then I'm already
really suffering because I'm this thing. Yeah.
Right. But can we just open ourselves to others instead of, I want to really displace our egos if at all possible, and say, well, how does this open me to the rest of the world, or connect me to others, or show me a larger story? So I'm going to combine a few things unfairly with time in mind. So Mary had asked about kind of responding gracefully to anti-maskers, which is a tricky one, and maybe just to those with whom we're struggling at the moment. And Bob had also asked a question about your understanding of evil during this time. And as we are, excuse me, as we're looking at that, Catherine also posted Marjorie's poem in the chat for those who might like to read it. So,
yeah. So I don't have an answer to any of these questions. I don't have anything particularly even profound to say about them. I think the anti-vaxxers and the anti-maskers and one of the, it's, there's so many things to be said, but one thing that I have reflected on, I'm closest to that world via Oklahoma, and the governor of Oklahoma has virtually made it illegal to issue a mask mandate, even though cities and systems are finding ways to work around it, loopholes in the system. But as watch, as we all do, as we watch people who oppose the vaccine then die because of that position that they've taken. And I often find myself puzzling. This is not an answer to that question, but I wonder, is not getting a vaccine, what is the connection? Why is that? There has to be something more to opposing the vaccine that makes you willing to lay down your life and die for it. And what is that? Is that self-hatred and loathing? Is that political ideology run totally amok? What is that? That makes you willing to put your own life and the life of others at such profound risk? When the stakes are, it's so easy not to. It's not like you have to do a lot to not do that. I guess that's related to the question of evil. I don't have an answer to how evil relates to all of this, except to say that that I don't think that evil is, another entity that's up there doing battles next to that anthropomorphized God, as an anthropomorphized source of evil in the world. But I think evil lives in the systems that we build. Evil lives in the way in which our identities are constructed, that create in us cruelty and fear, and that how it ebbs and flows throughout our history is in large part, and how it relates to the power of God, I think, is mysterious. And if you ever find anyone who wants to say things about evil more than the reality that it's both systemic and it lives within us and it is against the will of God, if you get much beyond saying those kinds of things about it, then you risk stepping into mysteries that you don't know about, and perpetrating evil itself by claiming to know more than we can. I think there was a third part of that question. There was the anti-masks, the evil, and what was the third part?
I think those were the only two parts I recall. I mean, and they're not small questions.
They're not small. And I find myself, usually I give lectures and I'm like, I know all my content, and I can tell you all this work I've done, blah, blah, blah. I'm an expert in this theory. That's why you've had me come and talk to you as a theologian. But talking about this pandemic, that we're all in the middle of. I find myself often just like, I don't know. I'm trying to figure this out alongside you all. So I apologize for my like inability to come forth with brilliant insight into this. I don't know.
No, well, and I think it's kind of wonderful. Well, I'm not sure wonderful is the right word. I think it's extraordinary that we're all doing this in real time together.
Yeah.
And friends from church will know that I'm a complicated medical case and highly vulnerable. And I have an amazing team of doctors who also don't know and are learning in real time. And over 18 or 19 months, what we know has changed. And it will ask me in a month or two, it will have changed again. And I see the best and the brightest, most wonderful people giving everything they can theologically, medically, socially, and our educators, so many people, and we're all figuring it out.
Yeah.
And so, and at the same time that we're enduring this trauma and we have that animal thing going on where we want to run and collapse, and we're also working the problem at the same time. And I want to just give everyone some love and gratitude for all that is being done. And Serene, what you remind me of, and I hope this is good for the group to hear, is that theology isn't so much about, to me, it's not at all about absolute answers. It's about deepening questions and interpretations and that real struggle of trying to tell the truth. And who among us knows an absolute truth? I mean, I could make some claims about love and things like that, and I would, I guess, but there's a lot of unknowing, and I think humility and kindness are called for, but I would just, I think oftentimes when people hear from a distinguished guest like yourself, they may be expecting that you'll bring us a list of answers or solutions, when I think there's the really good part is you're sharing questions with us, and we're all sharing questions together, and that's the role of these lectures, and I think that's part of the role of church too. So there are many other questions, and I want to make sure we get a couple more, mindful of our time, friends. Let's see. And Barbara Cole asks how we might envision a grace. You mentioned a litany of people who may be disenfranchised, left out, harmed. How can we envision a grace that encompasses them and their lives? And I think that's the gist of her question. More of a global type of grace, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing about grace that's so profound for me, is that when I imagine the love of God that is eternal, holding the world as it suffers, and also holding the world in its delights, but holding the world as it suffers, that grace is true. It's just true. That you were just saying something about true. I would. That's the one thing I would go out on a limb and say I know is true. Is that love of God, and it's true whether you know it or not. So, but knowing the love of God does change the way you view everything in the world, because you can no longer treat anyone as if they're not a beloved child of God as well. So in that regard, in describing grace, I'm not necessarily describing something that everyone actually experiences. I think many people never have the opportunity to experience that. But I also think that it doesn't mean that they aren't held and loved by God. I also think that that long litany I gave, often think people who suffer have a more profound sense of grace than those who have only known privilege, because they can't survive without it. So I wouldn't assume that the forces that break us and oppress and destroy necessarily correlate with an inability to know grace. That's why we know so many of the most profound insights into grace have come from communities who have suffered enormous oppressions.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that. I also think of, and I just sort of wanted to throw this in as we begin to wrap up, but I think of the music that has come out of different communities, not only the spirituals and the blues, but I think of Woody Guthrie's folk music and Curtis Mayfield, as mentioned last night, and some of the extraordinary music that can sustain us, that arises, that comes out of places of struggle and suffering. And so I just toss that out there. If anyone's having a difficult day, one of the many things we can do is find some music that resonates and that can carry us. And I think we have mostly, there's some comments that are worth reading and looking at. And as we begin to wrap up, friends, I would say that one of the many good pieces of this is that we will continue the conversation. So if you'd like to continue this on October the 7th, in the evening, we will meet for our conversations in theology and ethics, and we'll be discussing Call It Grace, and kind of continuing through the book. So please join us. If you're on this list, we can send you just a notification as to how you could join if you'd like to. But I think we'll keep our conversations going and keep caring for each other during a difficult time. So Serene, I want to give you the last word, but it's been such a delight to spend some time with you this way. And we send you, warm wishes from here in Charleston to New York.
Well, thank you. And thank you for this time with you and for your questions and your comments. And thank you for having an amazing pastor. I'm very, very thankful for this church that such an amazing person is providing leadership. You. I'm saying thank you to your church for you. And we're in this together, all of us, as human beings, as Christians, as people who just live up and down the coast from one another, and mostly we're in this together as children of love.
Amen.
So amen.
All right. Thank you so much, Serene, and thank you, friends, for joining us. Take good care, and we'll look forward to the next time that we connect.